There are things that walk among us, unseen. Ancient forces that do not sleep. They do not beg, nor do they bargain. They wait. Patiently. Watching. And when a man comes to them with empty hands but a heart full of greed, they do not turn him away. No. They welcome him. This is the story of a man who sought more than the world was willing to give. A man who stood at the crossroads of fate and reached out to grasp what was never meant for him. And for a time, he had it all. Wealth. Power. The respect of men. But what he took was never his to keep. The debt was always there, waiting to be paid. And when the time came, when the shadow stretched long and the whispers turned to voices that spoke his name, there was nowhere left to run. You may think you know how this ends. You do not. Stay with me, and listen closely. Emeka had always hated the sound of hunger. The way it grumbled in his stomach like a beast clawing for escape, the way it whispered in his mother's tired sighs, the way it settled in the corners of their mud hut, gnawing at the edges of their already fraying existence. He had grown up watching men with full bellies and heavy pockets stroll through the village, their laughter loud, their fingers dripping with gold. They dine at the finest tables, their wives adorned with the richest fabrics, their children never knowing the weight of an empty pot. And Emeka. Emeka had nothing but dust beneath his feet and dreams too large for his hands to hold. He despised it. The begging, the scraping, the endless cycle of survival. He swore to himself he would not die poor. When he spoke of his ambition, the elders only shook their heads. A man must climb with his own hands, they said. Not all roads lead home. But what did they know of hunger? Of shame? Of the nights when he lay awake, staring at the thatched roof, cursing the fate that had placed him in the arms of poverty. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, an old woman called to him. Her voice was like dried leaves rustling in the wind, her back bent with the weight of years. You move too fast, boy, she murmured. The world does not give freely. It only trades. Emeka scoffed. Old people and their riddles. He was tired of warnings, tired of waiting. If the world would not give him its riches, he would take them himself. And so, he walked to the marketplace, where men battered and voices rose like a restless sea. It was there, between the sellers of yams and cloth, past the scent of roasted groundnuts, that he saw him. A man. Not quite like the others. His robes were fine, yet no dust clung to them. His sandals were old, yet his feet never seemed to touch the earth. His face was neither young nor old, and when he smiled, the gaps between his teeth seemed to stretch just a little too wide. Emeka did not know why his chest tightened when the man's gaze met his. There was no reason to fear him. He was simply a stranger, standing too still in a place where everyone moved. And then the man spoke. You are hungry for more, he said, his voice smooth, knowing. You are tired of being the one who watches from the corners. Tired of licking the crumbs from another man's fist. Emeka swallowed. He had told no one these thoughts, yet they sat in the stranger's mouth like old truths. The man stepped closer. I can help you, he said. You have a fire in you? But fire without wood dies. Let me give you the wood. Emeka listened. Gold beyond his wildest dreams. Land to call his own. Power to make men bow in his presence. All of it, his. A dream, no longer out of reach. Only a small favor in return. Emeka hesitated, but only for a moment. Men had built wealth through worse means. Hadn't the chiefs of old conquered with swords? Hadn't merchants traded human flesh for silver? No great man was truly innocent. And he would be great. The man produced a parchment, old as time itself, its edges curling like withered leaves. The writing shimmered, shifting in the firelight of a nearby brazier, symbols twisting into words he understood without reading. The ink was dark, too dark. The man held out a dagger, small and sharp. A single drop, he said. And your life will change forever. Emeka took the blade. His hands did not tremble. The tip kissed his skin. A bead of red bloomed against his finger. The parchment drank it greedily. The man's smile widened. And in that moment, as the air grew thick, as the wind stilled, as the shadows lengthened, something shifted. The deal was made. And a debt, whether known or unknown, had begun its path toward payment. The morning came with the scent of fresh rain on the earth. The village stirred awake as it always did, women bent over fire pits, children chasing each other through the dust, traders setting out their wares. But in one corner of the village, in a hut that had always been plain, something had changed. Emeka opened his eyes to a world that was no longer the same. Where there had once been rough straw beneath him, there was now silk. Where his mat had been worn and thin, his back now rested on something soft, too soft, something that sank beneath his weight as though cradling him. He sat up sharply, his fingers running over the fabric. It was not his. It was not anything that should have belonged to him. And then he saw them. Bags. 3. No, 4. Gold spilled from their mouths, shimmering in the weak morning light. Coins stacked high, more than he had ever seen in his lifetime, more than any man in the village had ever possessed. His breath caught. His heart pounded. He reached out, almost afraid it would disappear the moment he touched it. But the gold was real. Solid. Cold beneath his fingers. Wealth. True wealth. The kind he had longed for. The kind men bowed to. The kind that wiped away the shame of a name spoken with pity. Emeka rose to his feet, his body light, his mind reeling. Outside, the village continued as if nothing had changed. But everything had. He no longer belonged among the ones who struggled, the ones who bent beneath the weight of empty pockets. He walked through the market that day with heavy steps, the gold tied in a pouch at his waist. He did not bargain. He did not plead for scraps. He bought. Freely. Carelessly. He took what he wanted, fine cloth, a goat for roasting, the juiciest fruits piled high in baskets. Men turned to look. Women whispered. Emeka, the beggar, the struggler, the dreamer of empty dreams, now walked like a man who owned the very ground beneath his feet. By sundown, the hut was no more. Brick rose where mud had stood. Wooden beams replaced the fragile sticks that had once held up his roof. The doors were strong, carved with the marks of wealth, and inside, the light of oil lamps glowed against golden plates, rich fabrics, and furniture no one in the village had ever seen before. And then came the feast. Night after night, Emeka opened his doors to the people. The poor and the rich alike gathered in his courtyard, feasting on roasted meat, drinking palm wine until the ground spun beneath their feet. The drummers played, the dancers moved, and laughter rang through the air like birds in flight. Emeka sat among them, draped in the finest robes, his fingers heavy with rings, his voice carrying above the rest. When he laughed, others laughed with him. When he spoke, men listened. He was no longer the boy who had nothing. He was the man who had everything. But there were things, small, at first. Things he pushed away, things he convinced himself did not matter. The first was the knock. It came at midnight. A single knock. Loud enough to wake him, but when he rose and opened the door, there was nothing. No footsteps in the dust, no whisper of movement. Just the night, still, watching. The second was the shadow. One evening, as he stood before his mirror, admiring the fine cloth draped over his shoulders, he noticed it. His own reflection moved as it should have. His lips curved into a smirk, and his reflection did the same. But his shadow did not. It lagged, just a second too late, just enough for his breath to hitch, just enough for something in his chest to tighten. He blinked, shook his head, convinced himself he had imagined it. But the next day, as he walked through the village, the sun high above him, he noticed the way it stretched long on the ground. Longer than it should have. And once, just once, when he turned a corner, he swore he saw it move before he did. Still, he told himself there was nothing to fear. And then came the old woman. She appeared at the edge of the feast one evening, standing among the flickering lamps, her eyes sharp, piercing. She did not step forward. She did not touch the food or join the others in laughter. She simply watched. And when he met her gaze, she mouthed the words. The debt must be paid. Emeka's stomach clenched, but he tore his gaze away. The drums pounded. The wine flowed. And still, the knock came at midnight. Still, the shadow moved on its own. And still, in the darkest corners of his home, the gold did not shine as brightly as before. The night was thick with heat, the air heavy with the scent of dying embers. The feast had ended, but the echoes of laughter still clung to the walls of Emeka's grand house. The courtyard was empty, the last of his guests stumbling home, bellies full, minds hazy with drink. Emeka sat alone, his robe loose around his shoulders, his rings pressing against his fingers, heavier than before. The oil lamps flickered, casting long shadows across the room. And then, a whisper. Low. Crawling. Treading through the stillness. A voice. Calling his name. Emeka, it is time. A chill ran down his spine. He turned sharply, his breath caught in his throat. The room was empty. But the voice was there. It did not come from outside. It did not seep through the windows or slip through the cracks of the door. It was inside. Around him. Inside him. A pressure settled in the air, thick, unrelenting. The flames of the lamps wavered, shuddering as if something unseen had entered the room. Emeka rose to his feet, the floor suddenly colder beneath him. His heart pounded, but he straightened his shoulders. He was a man of wealth, of power. Whatever this was, whatever game the spirits played, he would not be afraid. And then he saw it. The mirror. The reflection staring back at him. It was him. And yet, it was not. The eyes, darker, deeper, swelling with something unnatural. The smile, wider, stretching too far. And when he moved, the reflection did not follow. Emeka stepped forward, his breath shallow. His own face twisted before him, shifting, warping, becoming something no longer human. The mouth opened, but it was not his voice that spoke. Did you think it was yours? Emeka stumbled back. Did you think you could take and never pay? The voice wrapped around him, thick like smoke, curling into his ears. The air grew tighter, pressing against his chest. He could not move. Then, before him, in the flickering light, something took shape. The man from the market. No longer smiling. No longer pretending. His face was long, his skin stretched too thin over sharp bones. His eyes, hollow, endless, pulling everything into their depths. His robe swayed though there was no wind, and his hands, long and clawed, folded before him as though he had been waiting. Emeka tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The figure took a step forward. The walls of the house groaned. The air thickened. Wealth is never given, the voice murmured. It is only borrowed. And the time has come for you to return what was never yours. Emeka's knees buckled. His breath came in short gasps. He fell to the floor, his hands grasping at the golden rings on his fingers as if they could save him. He reached for the coin stacked on the table. He pulled the strings of his heavy pouch, letting gold spill to the ground. Take it. His voice cracked. Take it all. My land, my riches, everything. But leave me. A chuckle. Low, amused. The figure shook its head. Foolish man, it murmured. You were never meant to enjoy this wealth. It was only a loan. The lamps flickered once, twice, then died. Darkness. Silence. And then, a scream. Emeka clutched his chest, his body convulsing as a force unseen wrapped around him. His skin burned. His veins turned black beneath his flesh. He tried to rise, to run, but his legs betrayed him. The walls trembled. The ground beneath him cracked. Outside, the village stirred. People rose from their beds, their ears straining. Whispers carried through the wind. shadows stretched where no light fell. The air was thick, wrong, filled with something ancient. A child peered out from a window and gasped. Emeka's house, so grand, so full of life only hours before, was changing. The doors twisted, bending as if something inside clawed at them. The windows darkened, no longer reflecting light. And the walls, thick, strong, began to crack. The villagers gathered, standing at the edge of the courtyard. But none dared move closer. None dared cross the invisible threshold where the air grew heavier, pressing against their skin, warning them to stay away. A final wail rang through the night, chilling and desperate. Then silence. A single gust of wind swept through the village, carrying away the last remnants of laughter, of feasting, of life. By morning, the house stood empty. The golden plates, the fine cloth, the treasures Emeka had once flaunted, all had turned to dust. And Emeka was gone. Some say he was swallowed by the earth itself. Some say the spirits dragged him into the shadows, into a place where the greedy are taught the weight of their own desires. And some say that on quiet nights, when the wind is still, when the lamps flicker without reason, when the silence grows too deep, a single knock can be heard at the door. A whisper follows. A voice, low, familiar. Still pleading. Still begging. Still paying the price of a debt that could never be repaid. A poor and ambitious man named Emeka despises his life of poverty and longs for wealth. One evening, he meets a mysterious man who offers him unimaginable riches in exchange for a small favor. Blinded by greed, Emeka signs a contract with his own blood, ignoring the warnings of an old woman who tells him that all wealth comes at a cost. The next morning, Emeka wakes up rich beyond belief. He builds a grand mansion, throws lavish feasts, and becomes the wealthiest man in the village. But soon, strange things begin to happen. A knock at midnight with no one there. A shadow that moves on its own. The old woman reappears and warns him his debt must be paid. One night, the dark figure returns, revealing that the riches were never truly his, they were only borrowed. Emeka begs for his life, offering gold, land, and power, but the entity only laughs. The house begins to shake, the air thickens, and Emeka vanishes, his scream swallowed by the night. By morning, his mansion is cursed and abandoned, his wealth reduced to dust. Years later, a new traveler arrives, drawn to the tale of Emeka's vanished fortune. He enters the ruins and finds an old contract lying untouched. The ink is still fresh. The words still whisper. The cycle begins again. The story serves as a warning: greed is never without consequence. Wealth that comes too easily always has a price. And when the spirits give, they always return to collect. Thank you for watching this story. Kindly share your thoughts in the comment section. Give the story a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Stay tuned for the next story. See you, bye.